Good morning. Yes, Roy Murray Pryor. I'm doing this presentation, but my colleagues in crime are Tracy, Peter, Angela and Anthea, but any issues you have with it, I'll take responsibility. I thought what was interesting, I want you to focus on a couple of words there, distrust and collaboration. And I thought it was interesting this morning that the two keynote speakers also implicitly talked about collaboration. Anthony used the word embedded research, and in the second keynote, they were actually using collaborative processes as part of that. And I think we need to focus on those, and that's how we're going to overcome distrust. This paper, this paper is basically derived from question 7.2 from the scientific consensus statement and uses the approaches that we had to use for that. But the critical question for me is, how do we develop and adopt better management practices to overcome the issues with water quality? If we don't do that correctly, we're just wasting our money. It's based on, as I said, the processes that we used. We only looked at refereed papers from 2000, over 2,500, and there was a whole range of methods used for that. But in looking at this issue, what we decided is we needed a framework to think about this. Because when people think about factors influencing the adoption of management practices, they tend to think about farmers. And that's been the problem. And to my mind, we have to think about the agricultural innovation system which develops and promotes the particular practices. And if we don't get that right, we're not going to get anything right. And that's essentially what was being said this morning already. And so an agricultural innovation system is a process in which learning and development occurs, and it involves organisations and individuals, and it includes a whole range of things going on. And what we have to recognise about why we need a framework is because it's a wicked problem. There is no one problem and there is no one solution, and the problems continue to change, and the solutions will continue to change, and there is no best solution. We just have to keep working on it. And what really annoys me is that I've been an extension officer, involved in extension most of my life, and we always get blamed if something goes wrong. And the problem quite often exists further at another part of the system. It's not the farmers and the extension people where the issue arose, it's the system effects that are largely responsible. So to help us with thinking about this, we needed to take account. We started with a ecological systems framework, talking about the macro, the meso and the micro parts down to the practice characteristics. And then we developed something. The World Bank finally, about 10 years ago, realised that they'd stuffed up most of their life in doing development, particularly in agriculture, and realised that you need to think about the agricultural innovation system. So this is based on some of their work and some work. We developed an agricultural agribusiness innovation systems model back actually in Indonesia in the 90s, where I was working. And so we need to think about the framework within which everything sits. We need to think about the value chains. In the Great Barrier Reef, there's sugar, beef, and horticultural mainly. We need to think about the actors involved with that. We need to think about all the institutions involved in that. But most importantly, we need to think about how governance works in that system. And so we've adapted this from a paper by De Boon that came out in 2022, in which they talk about how the macro governance systems govern and moulds what occurs at the meso-micro level, and also what sort of innovation processes occur. In other words, how we conduct the RD&E. And each of these interact with each other. So the type of system you've got for innovation processes interacts with the people that it works on, and also influences the characteristics of the innovations that you develop and people's beliefs in them. And so we needed to consider these factors about the meso-micro context, the actors right from the farmers right up through the chains. And also we need to consider the innovation processes that we use. In other words, how do we go about deciding what to work on, how to fund it, how to design it, how to develop it. And I thought it was interesting that Ames was talking about their different levels, right through from just telling people through to people taking control. So this uptake continues to be a wicked problem, and so we need to consider the factors at all levels. The policy decisions in one area can have a negative effect on things going on at another area. For example, regulations have had that effect. And they've contributed to landholder distrust, where just a number of speakers have been talking about trust and distrust. And I think Megan's going to be talking about how you build relationships to do that later after me. And another issue we found is that the mixes of instruments are not integrated or integrated to provide support. So what do we conclude about the factors? Look, to be honest, as an extension person, when I worked in it, I wasn't interested in studies telling me what factors were influencing farmers' adoption. Farmers could tell me that, right? I needed to find a process. It was about the process I used to work with the farmers, to work out what the issues were and how we could make change. So it's not so much about the factors, because they're all context dependent and vary from farmer to farmer. And perceptions of what's important vary depending on which particular theoretical framework you use. I think one thing I want to emphasise, we need to demonstrate links between change and water quality, because some people don't believe what we're doing is going to make a difference. Unless we can find a way to demonstrate that, they're not going to be interested in what you're talking about. We did come up with some factors for sugar, compatibility with farming system practices, economies of size issues, the characteristics of their technologies, the same with grazing. There were slightly different interrelationships in grazing. It was particularly influenced by financial issues and particularly transaction costs involved with making change. And in terms of the urban environment, the evidence was limited, basically. So finally, what am I going to say? I'm going to say that the macro context directs and moulds what we're doing. So we've all known how the media has a role in this, and what line they take influences what happens. So we need to find ways of overcoming negative effects of the media. Unfortunately, our history has created levels of distrust, and unless you overcome that distrust, then you're not going to get anywhere. And so we need to develop processes, and as I keep on saying, it's not the knowledge, it's not the practice, it's the process that you use to institute change. So we need to develop, test, scale, monitor and evaluate practices with the people who are going to be responsible for implementing them. We start with them. And I like that one about the paint tins, because that's generally what happens. You know, you bring a social science, or you bring an extension, or you bring an economist along after you've developed it, and you say, and they say to you, can you help me sell this? And you say, well, you've come up with the wrong solution to the wrong problem, right? And so we've got to start. So my idea with the paint tin should be, rather than have the paint tin for marine science, we have the paint tin for human dimensions, and then we add bits of marine science and agricultural science and whatever other science you want to add to that tin, right? We don't start with those tins and then add and then add the social science to it, the processes to it. We need to think about it the other way round. Thank you.